journey through the wonderful world of vintage radios starts with a visit to a personal museum in a radio station located at Ocala, Florida. At WMOP, there is a wonderful collection of more than 1,000 radios on hand to see.
What we've tried to do is most collectors that we've run into collect one particular kind of radio. They'll collect Scott radios or Crosley radios. Crosley probably the most popular collectibles. I find more Crosley collectors than anything else. But there are lots of others too, but most people usually zero in on one kind of radio. What we've tried to do is buy as many different radios as we could, because there were thousands of radios, models made, just thousands of them, and thousands of companies. I'm amazed at how many people made radios. But what we've tried to do is get as wide a variety of pieces as we could, and consequently we have a large number of radios rather than well, I don't think we have what anyone would call a magnificent collection of this, that, or the other. We do have a lot of quantity.
Admiral Radio had its roots with a company named Continental. This company made radios in the 20s and early 30s for Admiral and several other sales companies. Continental radios were made in Chicago through 1938, at which time they changed their name to Admiral, and by 1939 the company ranked number 5 in radio sales. Admiral held its own in the marketplace through the 1940s and into the 1950s. Soon, however, sales slipped because of overseas competition with cheaper sets, and by 1979, Admiral was forced to close its last plant. Aetna radios were sold by Walgreen drugstores from 1936 to 1942. Aetnas found their way into many homes and, like so many others, announced our entry into World War II with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Aircastle radios were made by several manufacturers, including Continental. Aircastles were sold through Spiegel's catalog. Another store brand, Airlines, were sold by Montgomery Ward. Ward's advertised radios for sale as early as 1922. Early Ward sets were manufactured by a company called Tri-City. Later sets were made by a variety of other companies such as Belmont Radio Corporation, Wells Gardner, David Sonhays, and U.S. Radio and Television. Airline was big in mail-order radios sold, second only to Silvertone, sold through Sears Roebuck catalogs and stores. Many radio manufacturers had their origins producing and selling a variety of products. For instance, Airway Electric Appliance Company of Toledo, Ohio, started their business in 1920 by making vacuum cleaners. Airway's brief radio career started in the early 20s and was over by 1926. With their roots in magnetos and automobile parts, American Bosch Magneto Corporation of Springfield, Massachusetts, ventured into the radio business in 1925. As the company grew, American Bosch also made radios for Sonora and Eveready. However, by 1937, American Bosch gave up radio production as competition grew intense. The world was changing in 1937. Italy withdrew from the League of Nations. Japan invaded China, seizing Peking and Nanking. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of giving women minimum wages. Arvin radios of the time promoted a phantom circuit so that listeners could better hear their favorite programs, such as Dorothy Hart, sponsored by Sunbright Cleaner, and Quick Arrow Soap Flakes. Hopalong Cassidy appeared as a TV show in 1948, sweeping the country. Overnight, we were inundated with Hopalong Cassidy. In the roll call of radio history, the aluminum-faced Hopalong Cassidy radio may be the model Arvin is most remembered for. Based in Columbus, Indiana, Arvin radios were made by Noblet Sparks Industries, a company originally founded to make automobile parts. No one really knows how many companies made radios. Odd brands like Astatic show up here and there and are both a curiosity and a wonderful addition to the radio age. In addition to radios, Astatic also made crystal phonograph cartridges and microphone cartridges. A remarkable pioneer of early radio, Atwater Kent also had his roots in electrical parts for automobiles as far back as 1910. In 1922 or so, Atwater Kent Manufacturing Company of Philadelphia started marketing radio components that were placed on a board. The famous Atwater Kent breadboard radios were born and are essential pieces for serious collections. Some Atwater Kent radios were designed along the lines of furniture. Console radio design quickly gained popularity during the late 1920s. Radios were shrinking in size as the cost of making them and affording them during the Great Depression was becoming more difficult. Due to reported conflicts with industry and government, Atwater Kent went out of business in 1936, and a true pioneer of radio history faded from the scene. Some radios were more regional than national. Information on them can be little to nothing. This Baronet is an example of a fine little radio with nothing really to identify it. This Bendix Model 526C was found in a thrift store for $7.50. Not too bad a deal, since it is the highly popular Catlin style and may be worth up to 100 times the thrift store price. A rather late comer in radio manufacturing, Bendix Aviation Corporation of Baltimore formed a new division and started making aircraft and consumer radios in 1937. With the advent of World War II, Bendix Aviation became a major supplier of radios and other communications equipment for military purposes to British and American governments. Breville was a very nice radio, and again one of the many brands that briefly took their place in radio history. (1845) was another landmark year in history. As Andrew Jackson died, Texas and Florida became states. The first artistic photographic portraits were taken by David Octavius Hill. E.B. Bigelow constructed a power-driven loom to make carpets, and Brunswick Balk Collender began making bowling and billiard supplies. Brunswick Mersmann made wind-up phonographs and ventured into radio in 1925 or 1926 when they began buying RCA Radiola AC power amps. This Brunswick Model 15 was innovative for its time. It was completely built by Brunswick with such advanced features as a shrouded chassis and an audio power printed circuit board. This printed circuit board was a first for this industry. Brunswick sold their radio, phonograph, and recording business to Warner Brothers in 1930. Capehart may best be remembered for their elaborate record changer models. This 1935 Capehart multiple record changer did for the home what jukeboxes were doing at the malt shops. Record players went from single record play to multi-select play machines. Records, however, did take quite a bit of abuse in these old Capeharts. The company was bought by Farnsworth of Fort Wayne, Indiana after World War II, absorbed Dumont in 1955, and lasted until 1972. Clinton's had a reputation for being a quality radio. This Chicago-based company made radios for 9 years, producing thousands of brands during the 1930s. To be an authentic Clinton, the radio must have been made in Plant A. The Crosley Pup, sometimes known as the Sky Terrier, is one of the most sought-after sets today. Simple but effective. People used earphones to hear radio broadcasts of the time. Another pioneer and long-term radio success story is that of Crosley. The story goes that Powell Crosley wanted to buy a radio for his son. He found the $130 price tag too rich for his tastes. So he came up with a cheaper design and in the early 1920s produced what he called the Model Ts of radio. The earliest tube sets were battery-powered. However, by late 1926, battery sets were destined to be replaced by radios using alternating current. The advancement and availability of alternating current to homes eliminated the need to use batteries, which were dangerous, expensive, and a nuisance to maintain. By 1927, AC power radios were flooding the marketplace. By 1928, radios were in parlors, kitchens, workshops, garages, and offices everywhere. The world was listening as Herbert Hoover was elected president, and Amelia Earhart became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic. Jack Sharkey became world heavyweight boxing champion, and Gene Tunney hung up his gloves forever. The first Mickey Mouse movies drew crowds to the theaters, while radio brought news of Chiang Kai-shek being elected president of China. And the World Series kept listeners glued to their sets as the Yankees beat the Cardinals. The Great Depression was in full swing by 1933, and Crosley was fighting to stay in the radio business while others were hearing the bell toll. Crosley Fiber sets were powerful 5-tube sets of simple design. They were designed to keep Crosley strongly entrenched in the medium and low-end radio markets. Powell Crosby operated station WLW in Philadelphia, the nation's station, beaming programs out to listeners with 500,000 watts of power. WLW was the cornerstone for the Mutual Network that began in 1934. Console sets were always popular. However, grand designs of the 1930s now gave way to less ornate and modern styling of the 1940s. Plastic replaced both wood and Bakelite, and radios after World War II were influenced by many factors, including aviation themes and styling. Crosley radios were made up to the 1950s and ended with novelty radios that had miniature peanut tubes combined with transistors. This 1980s model CR1 Crosley is a reproduction. It provides a nostalgic look back at one of the greatest radio companies of our past. Hugo Gernsback designed this marvelous crystal set to capture the weak and distant signals of early sporadic radio broadcasts around 1910 to 1915. Concentrating more on the literary aspects of the radio culture, Hugo Gernsback was quick to proclaim that radio would never become successful unless it could be used easily in the home by anybody. Mr. Gernsback liked to make predictions, most of which came true. The Gernsback Radio Supply Company was one of the first of its kind. Dr. Lee DeForest's contribution to the development of radio was the vacuum tube. This invention made it possible to amplify radio signals received. By 1911, the vacuum tube started to replace the galena crystal as a detector and made practical radio receivers possible. DeForest radios were made between 1922 and 1933. Radio production ceased in 1933 when company patents were sold to RCA. Dr. DeForest struggled on, making amateur radio equipment. His battles with Edmund Armstrong, inventor of the regenerative circuit, consumed much of his time and most all of his fortunes. DeForest's place in radio history is one of controversy. Delco radios of Kokomo, Indiana were made by United Motors Service, a division of General Motors. Delco shifted from making home radios in 1933 and started producing auto radios. They returned to the home market in 1938. DeWalt radios were made by Pierce Arrow of New York City. DeWalt was still around in the late 1950s, making neat little transistor radios. Eagle was another company that started in 1922. 5 years later, they were out of business. Eagle Radio became a part of Wurlitzer in 1927. A highly respected radio company, Emerson Radios provided superior quality at reasonable prices. The Model 411 Mickey Mouse radio was made of pressed wood. This was a first for radio cabinetry. Ironically, of all early Emersons, this cheaply made set is one of the most sought after and expensive to own.
While I was here, I ran across a very small radio, an old-time radio that resembled the one that I had heard when I was young. And so I asked to buy it, which I did, and that was my first introduction to collecting. I guess that would have been in 1954. And I kept looking at the little radio. It was an Emerson radio. And the more I looked at it, the more I appreciated not just the fact that sound came out of it, but that somebody had taken an awful lot of time to to build this little box. It's a magnificent little radio, and the detail on it is fantastic. And so I got interested in the look of a radio box as well as the sound.
A popular feature were push buttons that allowed the setting of favorite stations. The call letters found on these early sets carry a bit of history as they show us which local and national stations people listened to. Styling was always important at Emerson. This company heavily promoted Art Deco design in their radio models. During the Depression, Emerson radios were aimed at the low-priced market with their midget models, which continued well into the 1940s. The strategy worked, and Emerson quickly became one of the leaders in radio sales, while other companies lasted but a few short years. Post-war Emersons were innovative in looks, and this Model 561 inspired a bank look-alike. Miniaturization of military communication equipment during World War II helped in the development and acceptance of portables that were much in vogue after the war. By 1954, the transistor revolution had started to take over the portable radio market, and Emerson made some memorable radios in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Their 888 series were definitely influenced by the space race, with names like Atlas, Explorer, Galaxy, Satellite, Titan, Vanguard. This 1958 Pioneer 888 model was very popular for outdoors use. In 1971, Emerson suspended production. In 1976, Emerson returned and continues to be a major player today, having diversified operations into radio, VCRs, and television. Feda of Long Island, New York City, was there at the beginning of radio. Like many early companies, Feda enjoyed success because the demand for radios outstripped production. However, by the mid to late 1920s, the market was saturated and Feda sales started to decline. By 1932, the company was sold. Feda radios continued to be made by the new company, Feda Radio and Electric. The most popular collectible Feda is the Series 1000 Bullet, especially their Catalan models. Frank Angelo D'Andrea started the Feda Company in 1920 with the production of simple crystal sets. Philo Farnsworth was an engineer from Utah. His radios were made in Fort Wayne, Indiana. After World War II, Farnsworth bought Capehart. He was also instrumental in the development of early television, having licensed his invention, the image dissector, to RCA in the early 1930s. Mr. Farnsworth was the only single inventor to challenge and beat powerful RCA, winning substantial revenue rights for his license. Ferguson radios were made in New York City, where radio manufacturing was an important industry. Firestone radios were made for the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company of Akron, Ohio by various radio companies from 1938 to 1966. Another New York City-based company, Fried Eismann, was located on Hudson Street and began making radios in 1922. Business was short-lived for the original Fried Eismann company, however, and by 1924 they were in trouble when cheaper radios cut heavily into their market niche. With stocks declining, Fried Eismann was sold to the Charles Freshman Radio Company, but Freshman too faced similar problems, and by 1928 both original companies were gone. The Fried brothers formed new companies in 1931 and 1940. Radios with their name were made until 1955. General Electric, AT&T, Western Electric, and the United Fruit Company formed RCA in 1919 to keep control of overseas communication. GE made radios that were sold as RCA until 1930, when the General Electric trademark appeared on their own sets. General Electric was an early giant of radio manufacturing and remains so today.
This is the Cadillac of all radios. It was made by General Motors in 1932. It is a remote tuner. This thing had 2 tubes in it, and it allowed its owner to adjust the station by turning this knob and to turn it on and off with this knob. The unit itself picked up through a massive wire cable that led to a Model 150 in a Queen Anne cabinet. The inside of it, to show the dial, and what's in there is just absolutely nothing. It doesn't look like much at all. This particular set belongs to a friend of mine who found it at an antique shop up in Alabama.
General Motors Radio Corporation was formed with RCA and General Motors in 1929, a product of the ambitious mind of David Sarnoff, head of RCA, who got 49% of the stock. Gloritones were made by U.S. Radio and Television Corporation of Chicago, Illinois. The pointed cabinet top was a forerunner of the classic cathedral design so popular in the 1930s. A unique feature of this Gloritone was the chassis. It was mounted upside down. Goodyear radios, like Firestone, were made for the tire company by various manufacturers who labeled some of the parts with the tire company's trademark name. The first Grebes were crystal sets made in 1920. By 1925, A.H. Grebe produced this marvelous set with thumb wheel synchrophase tuning from his factory at 10 Van Wyck Avenue in Richmond Hill, New York. Like any new industry, there are those that fall by the wayside. Grebe was another victim in the radio production wars of the early days of radio. The Depression dealt a final blow, and Grebe was finished by 1932. Grigsby Grunow made early Grunow and Majestic radios. The Depression killed the Grunow Company, and the name was acquired by General Household Utilities of Chicago. This company continued making Grunows through the 1930s. Majestic became an independent radio company known as the Majestic Radio and Television Corporation. This is the end of Volume 1 of Around the Dial. We hope you enjoyed the presentation.